Hello and welcome back. I hope you're all well. I just want to say from the start that this will be talking about the attacks and its effects, but I will not be showing the planes hitting the towers or the buildings coming down or pretty much any graphic imagery. I'm not interested in shock value, and enough outlets will be showing it today. What I want to talk about is how the last 20 years have been dictated by the attacks on September the 11th, 2001, about how it has affected our culture, our institutions, our laws, even our morality. 20 years is a long time. It allows for emotions to cool, it allows for people to reflect, and it allows you to begin the act of looking back with clear eyes. As all students of history do, we constantly re-evaluate and re-examine the past, especially when it passes from the realm of the living to the realm of the historians, as World War I has, and as World War II is starting to. To start with, I was a young child on September the 11th, 2001. I remember being petrified. I was lucky enough to fly on planes quite a lot with my parents as a child, and I was terrified that next time we go on a plane, something like this would happen, or that the terrorists, I had just learned a new word, would hit my hometown. My mum found it quite funny telling me that story when I was a lot older, and I was rather mortified at my lack of understanding of geography, but it speaks to a larger thing. I, as a kid across a vast ocean in a completely different country, was terrified by these attacks. I can only imagine just how shocking, how frightening it must have been for Americans and even more so for New Yorkers and people in DC. I live in a country which has seen warfare and seen foreign attacks on our soil before. We even suffered terrorist attacks from the IRA in the 70s and 80s. It's not a new phenomenon in the United Kingdom. The United States has not seen large-scale combat or even loss of life on this scale on its mainland from a foreign source since probably the War of 1812. And at this point in time, in 2001, it seemed like the United States was truly untouchable. It was the preeminent, unchallenged superpower of the world. The Cold War was over, the economy booming, and then on a balmy, beautiful morning, 4 planes were hijacked. 3 hit their targets, and 2,977 people were killed in an attack that shocked the world. If you're wanting me to invalidate the pain, the suffering, the horror of the United States in the aftermath of those attacks, then you're in the wrong place. Because regardless of what you think about the United States, those attacks were a tragedy. Watching people trapped on the upper floors jump rather than face fire, or hearing recordings of desperate people calling for help, or even those resigned to their fate calling their family to tell them one last time that they love them, is nothing more than a true tragedy. The immediate response was bewilderment and shock. Nobody knew what was happening, why this was happening, or even who was responsible. So I'd like to start by talking about the infamous "the haters for our freedoms" line that even 20 years later persists. Bin Laden was very clear about why he attacked the United States after he took responsibility in 2004, and though all of his reasons are nonsensical and wrong, none of those reasons were about hating the US for their freedom. The reasons are varied, but amount to Bin Laden being upset over US interference in what he perceives as Muslim lands. His response was to target civilians, a belief for which he was expelled from the original group which he helped set up in the 80s prior to his formation of Al-Qaeda. And whilst I'll go into more depth on a video on the Afghanistan war, let it suffice to say that the Taliban are not the same as Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda attacked the United States, not the Taliban, not ordinary Afghani citizens, nor Saddam Hussein, nor Iraq. Culturally, the 9/11 attacks are a dividing point. You can see its effect on TV, on music, on art. It has changed everything. It is one of those moments that historians will use to mark the dividing line between eras. In the immediate aftermath, there was a great push for sensitivity in many TV shows, songs and films that showed the New York skyline prior to the attacks were either edited or removed from air. Terms such as first responders or ground zero became commonplace and even to this day a part of the vernacular across the Anglosphere. Subtly, there was also a shift in what sort of films were being made. Prior to that, the 2000s and 90s had a lot of disaster films. We all still laugh at the cringy so bad they're good 90s disaster films and horror films. After the attacks, immediately, there was a rise in very standard, almost hallmarky family films. Understandable, of course. People sought comfort in family when the world stopped making sense. After that, though, it gets interesting. The rise of a superhero genre is an effect of 9/11. I know that seems rather strange, but extrajudicial warriors, often American, usually carrying very American symbols, delivering justice to evil people abroad. Heck, in the first Iron Man film, the Jericho missile is a literal war crime waiting to happen, but the film makes you think, oh wow, awesome. Now I'm not saying you can't enjoy these films. Heck, I still love Iron Man, but we do also have to be aware of the cultural associations that stem from this. The first Iron Man film is 13 years old. Obama hadn't even won the presidency at that point. I watched it again with my sister for the first time in a long time, and it struck me as I was watching just how devalued brown lives are. Like, I know the film is trying to make the point that these are America's enemies and now this suited superhero can take them out with zero collateral damage, which is the aim of just about any military action. And Marvel themselves bring this up over and over through the Avengers series, that can superheroes act without constraint? We live in a world where the predominant entity is the nation state. That is a state that has complete sovereignty over its borders. No other nation can legally tell it what to do. Obviously this is a little different in practice, but this is how it works on paper. 9/11 broke this format. Prior to that, even organisations in the Cold War were almost always backed by states and were acting to take control of nation states. Al-Qaeda are neither of these things. They did not want control of a nation state. They were acting on behalf of nobody, and they were backed by nobody. They are, in a legal sense, a non-entity. Superheroes act for whom exactly? We have civilian control of the military, we have elections to determine our courses of action, there are chains of command, oversight, and a multitude of other ways to make sure that we do not make military mistakes that cost lives and start unnecessary wars. Who exactly is a superhero accountable to? They act unilaterally to save lives, which is fine until you look a little deeper. Imagine a superhero from the Netherlands, where the death penalty is illegal. Would a superhero from the Netherlands be justified in attacking an American prison to save the life of a prisoner who is about to be executed? It seems outlandish, doesn't it? But one of the key parts of sovereign states is that the government, the legally recognised government of that sovereign state, is free to make the laws in that state as it sees fit. It's how China, Russia and Saudi Arabia make the laws that so many other countries find barbaric, and how the United States can also make laws that other parts of the world find barbaric. Whose morality does a superhero who acts internationally enforce? What is the dividing line? Another really good example is abortion of all things. The United States is ridiculously hurtling towards a situation where abortion is not available in most of the southern states. Is a US superhero going to attack an abortion clinic to save a fetus in a world where abortion isn't legal? Can you imagine Batman beating up a doctor in an abortion clinic? Alternatively, is a European superhero going to attack a US court to free a woman who had an abortion? I know it sounds ridiculous, but do you see the very thorny issue that I'm getting at here? Almost all of these superhero films have almost exclusively American superheroes enforcing American morality and American notions of justice around the world. More often than not, the motivations of the bad people, not the main villain, but just the generic bad people, are never explored, nor even their position in their respective countries. For all we know, Iron Man could have shot people enforcing their own country's laws. More often than not, these people are labelled terrorists. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that these people are in any way good people as they're portrayed. I'm saying we don't actually know who they are. And calling someone a terrorist does not make someone a terrorist. In the real world, Al-Qaeda see themselves as freedom fighters, superheroes even, as do would Daesh, who you know as ISIS. If you look at it from their view, that is exactly what they'd say. Obviously they're not, they're ignorant barbarians. It might piss a lot of you off, but a lot of the superhero genre is exactly that. American laws being enforced unilaterally by American superheroes being feted and cheered without ever stopping to consider whether this is right or not. Something the boys touched on quite well during season 2. Do they serve America or do they serve humanity? The way the genre has panned out, it is far more likely to say superheroes serve America. Culturally, the United States after 9/11 became more paranoid, more fearful, more aggressive, and more feeling the need to flaunt American power, American superiority, and American exceptionalism wherever they were. The superhero genre is just one expression of this. There are numerous ways you can see this. Heck, 24, which was already a paranoid show as they debuted their first season in November of 2001, the second season onwards, filmed after 9/11, just devolved into a litany of senseless violence and misplaced sense of doing anything to get the job done, even though the methods used objectively do not work. The archetype of the reluctant everyman who does everything illegal and immoral, hampered by pesky laws and regulations to get the job done, has become one of the most popular in American TV and film. This neatly takes me towards the effect of 9/11 on our legality. The rule of law is one of the biggest identifiers of development in a society of civilization. To transition from the concept of might being right to a society of laws is a vital step towards creating a just, equal and fair society. In the aftermath of the attacks, as people scrambled to figure out what had happened, how it had happened and why it had happened, President Bush's team realised they had the opportunity to say something that they would not get again. For a brief moment in time, even the US's geopolitical critics and enemies stood as one and condemned this act. This left the space for the Bush Doctrine, and the raft of legislation pushed through without oversight and without consideration. This is the thing. When in times of crisis, it is vital for cool heads to prevail. You do not make emotional decisions without thinking through your actions. You take a rational look at what's happened and what your response should be. I'm not saying don't be angry and that you shouldn't feel, but do not let your actions be dictated by anger and those emotions. That is the point, privilege, and burden of leadership. The United States' response to 9/11 was not one of a cool head. It was one of an angry nation looking for vengeance, a country looking to feel strong again. It was a country looking to make others suffer for not only the injury, but also the insult that injury constituted. That's why the sweeping laws that passed immediately after authorizing force were so open-ended. It's why there was very little scrutiny, because any sign, any hint of non-compliance towards vengeance was a sign of siding with America's enemies. You only need look at the response of the single brave congresswoman who voted against the authorization of force, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who didn't even disagree with authorizing force, merely the level of the blank check it would give the executive branch. Another significant development was the authorization of information sharing. On the face of it, a good thing, because a joined-up approach allows you to build a holistic picture, and this is true. What else came into it was the authorization of sweeping unconstitutional surveillance powers that pretty much made every single American citizen the target of spying from their own government. Despite Snowden's revelations, this has not stopped. If anything, it has gotten worse. For all the complaints about the COVID vaccine's supposed microchip implants, there's simply no need. The federal government has access to pretty much every single bit of information they could require of you virtually, because the internet is still a wild frontier as far as the legal system is concerned, and the federal government can use any of these powers required to find whatever information on you that they want. Then you have things like the Patriot Act, which has, finally, after nearly 20 years, died a slow death. It allowed the United States to detain people without trial indefinitely. It expanded the powers of every single federal agency to intrusively look into the lives of innocent people without cause or even warrants at times. And it was passed without senators or representatives ever even bothering to read it. And now we get to the section that is potentially the most misunderstood: Guantanamo Bay, extraordinary rendition, and torture. The United States classified Al-Qaeda operatives and Taliban fighters as one and the same: non-state combatants who didn't wear a uniform and so were not entitled to the protection of the Geneva Conventions, even though the Geneva Conventions do actually apply here. By using this classification, they therefore said they could hold these people without civilian trial as they were not civilians, but because they were not enemy soldiers, they were not subject to military regulations. They existed between the spaces in a legal non-vacuum. That meant that the United States could do with them as they pleased. What Rumsfeld and others authorized as enhanced interrogation techniques involved the use of insects, sleep deprivation, waterboarding, beatings, and so on. This, by every understanding of the word, is torture. This is without talking about the non-approved stuff that people turned a blind eye to, such as rape and other forms of sexual assault, and despite attempts by senior US officials and TV shows alike, torture has not resulted in a single piece of actionable intelligence. Not one. Nada. Zilch. Zero. It has not made Americans any safer. If anything, it's made them more unsafe. When you are being tortured, you will say anything, and I mean anything, to make it stop. You will give whatever you think the interrogator wants to hear, not what actually occurred. Infamously, one detainee under torture gave the details of a plot to make it stop. It turned out that the plot was actually just the story of a movie he'd seen, because he didn't know anything else. So when you see Jack Bauer on your screens slamming a suspect's head onto the table to force them to speak, it just never happened. It doesn't work. And the damage to the US's reputation has been immense. This is not a program that happened in secret. The whole world found out about it pretty quickly. What Americans don't seem to have considered is that should an American be captured by a foreign or hostile entity, what grounds can the US demand humane treatment if these entities decide to use, as the US called it, enhanced interrogation? The United States and many other nations have changed legal codes to allow increased detention without trial, to allow increased surveillance without a warrant, heck, to even prevent detainees from knowing what the charges against them are. Countless other limits have been placed on legal codes that have restricted civil liberties. Even airport security has radically changed, despite not being effective at all, and for that, take a look at the 2015 Red Team Blue Team exercises. The laws we make, the laws we ignore, play a big role in how we look at ourselves. Were we good people? Were we just people? Were we tyrants? Monsters even? In a crisis, it is when we are tested most we see the true resilience of our system. It is when the horrible person who deserves no rights sees protection under those rights that we know that our system functions, because no matter how unpopular it is, no matter how ridiculous it seems, when we see the worst person being protected, we know that we are all protected. Legally, we have chipped away at those rights for the past 20 years, introducing abominable legislation that allows torture and extrajudicial killings. It shows we didn't react with measure because our leadership didn't react with measure. It reacted with aggression and political opportunism, and millions have died for it. Even our very morality has changed. Nowhere is this more evident than how hate-filled our politics has become. We've seen large crowds cheering Sarah Palin, saying how waterboarding is how we baptise terrorists. And if that isn't enough, whilst I'm not going to show the pictures, the treatment of prisoners at Abu Ghraib, which, contrary to popular opinion, was not the result of a few disaffected soldiers, but the deliberate policy decision of the Bush administration, making it clear that federal laws regarding torture did not apply in Iraq, and so torture should and could be used to interrogate prisoners. Numerous accounts of rape and sexual assault against Iraqi and Afghani civilians have emerged, with many more likely left unreported. The most infamous being a unit of soldiers raping a 14-year-old girl and then killing almost her entire family. Not all of the soldiers were even convicted in that case. In Afghanistan, the enslavement and use of young boys as sex slaves by Afghani soldiers was widely known and overlooked by US and NATO forces. Wanton killings continued in both countries, with innocent people frequently shot and murdered. The perpetrators of the Nisour Square massacre, who lied and lied and lied and to this day still lie, were pardoned by Trump. We've had soldiers urinate on the dead, dismember them, destroy civilian property, shoot innocents, psychologically torture them with the threat of violence, and so on and on and on and on. The list is endless of petty abuses that steadily scale upwards. Even the policy of drone strikes has been abhorrent. We've routinely killed hundreds of innocents to get maybe one person who may have been there, and that's only in the instance of targeted strikes. We also have signature strikes, which are pretty much 15 male and over. These people are uniformed. Often we can't even say if they're carrying anything that resembles a weapon. We've dropped missiles onto weddings, onto funerals, onto family gatherings. We've created a situation where the only United States that people across the Middle East know are the flags on the machines that kill them. Such was the level of desire for vengeance that even when the Taliban tried to surrender in 2001, the offer was rejected out of hand, and again in 2003 and again in 2011-12. This was no move for justice over the 9/11 attacks, it was a desire for vengeance, and as I've said at length, justice and vengeance are not the same thing. Lastly, the attacks have resulted in widespread racism and Islamophobia. If you look vaguely Muslimic, you are subject to suspicion and profiling at airports. It doesn't matter whether you are or aren't, doesn't matter whether you're the most American in existence, doesn't matter whether you've served your country. If you appear Muslimic, you will be profiled. This hatred and fear of Muslims, portraying them as some other, is worrying on multiple regards. We've had discriminatory laws, we've had frankly genocidal rhetoric, we've had concerted spying efforts without warrants. We've seen in Britain similar things and again in other countries. And the sad thing is that this constant othering is what makes it easier for terrorist organisations to recruit disaffected Muslims. Do you think a Muslim who feels respected, who feels like they belong, is going to want to harm that society? No. But a Muslim who feels othered, who is constantly subjected to discriminatory laws and regulations, who's found out that the police without cause were surveilling their place of worship and constant, countless indignities that non-Muslim people would never be subjected to, do you think that person would be malleable to recruitment? Instead of acting in concert with Muslim communities who usually suffer more because of each and every act of violence for which they are not responsible for, we as a society have acted to demonize, to marginalize and collectively punish. Islamophobia is now so rampant that it is barely worthy of remark. We have had far-right speakers given a mainstream platform to promote the ridiculous and outdated clash of civilizations theory or the equally ridiculous Great Replacement, and we've seen the Middle East and Muslims reduced to a faceless mass of people without distinction or nuance, exactly what those who hate European and American societies see from their own births. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is openly and happily Islamophobic. The former President of the United States is openly Islamophobic and still cheered by the majority of his party. The current President of France is openly Islamophobic. His main contender in the upcoming election is pretty much a fascist and also Islamophobic. This isn't a joke, it's not something to laugh at. It's serious and worrying for all those who see how open hate towards Muslims has become and crucially where that hate often leads to. But I come back to the attacks on this day 20 years ago. 3,000 people left their homes, expecting an ordinary day on a balmy September morning of clear blue skies. 3,000 people never made it home to their families. Each and every one of those deaths is a horrible, horrific tragedy. I still can't watch documentaries about it without being overwhelmed at the sheer horror of what is unfolding, just the same way I cannot watch documentaries or even read news articles about the Iraq and Afghanistan wars without being overwhelmed at the sheer, senseless brutality. Out of a rabid desire for vengeance, the United States and its allies set fire to 2 countries and destabilized the entire Middle East. The rise of Daesh, the increasing concentration of Iranian power, and other such effects are directly linked to the United States invading Afghanistan and then Iraq. In the future, as I said at the start about passing from the realm of a living to the realm of a historian, how do you think the future will look at our actions when they re-evaluate the attacks on September the 11th and the aftermath? It is perhaps one of the most tragic ironies to emerge out of the September 11th attacks that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind behind the attacks, could end up going free if he faces a civilian trial because much of the evidence gathered against him was obtained by torture, including his supposed confession. His trial has yet again been delayed. I'd like to end on something said by a refugee I spoke to many years ago. It's never left me, and it feels incredibly poignant. We were shocked and horrified at 9/11, but we didn't do it. We didn't do it. The United States has bombed my country because of this, but we didn't do it. It happened to them once. It's 9/11 every day for us. Thank you for listening. I hope that in the comment section and in other places everyone who watches and listens to this can be respectful, and I hope all of you take a moment to think about the 3,000 people who died on September the 11th and the millions more who died as a result of those attacks. I'll see you soon for a companion piece on the war in Afghanistan. Thank you and goodbye.